Welcome to the 10 a.m. Eastern Time session of Track 2, Timely and Topical, entitled A Conversation with Storyteller of the Year, Lisa Ling, sponsored by C3 Integrated Solutions. Before we begin, 1455 would like to thank our sponsors and panelists for their support and participation in the 2021 1455 Summer Festival. As a reminder, audience members are in listen-only mode. Chat and the Q&A functions are not available, but we do encourage you to keep these conversations going via social media. 1455 is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Also, please note that every summer festival session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand replay in the 1455 Attendee Hub a few hours after each session concludes. Lastly, in the event that you encounter technical difficulties viewing this session, we suggest either reloading the page or clicking the back button on your browser and then rejoining the session. Now, I'd like to turn the session over to the speakers to get started. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Hi, I'm Bill Wooden, President and founder of C3 Integrated Solutions, and we're proud to sponsor for the 1455 Literary Arts and absolutely thrilled to introduce this panel with the Storyteller of the Year. Now, you might think an IT company and literary arts aren't necessarily a perfect match, but for us, it makes perfect sense because for us, it's the stories that our clients tell when they come to us. Their pain points, their goals, their objectives, what they're trying to accomplish allows us to put solutions together that make their dreams a reality. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Sean Murphy, founder and executive director of 1455, and his interview with the Storyteller of the Year, Lisa Ling. Thanks.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Sean Murphy, and I welcome you to 1455's third annual Summer Festival. And one of our favorite parts of this entire process is awarding our Storyteller of the Year award. For those of you not familiar with 1455, we are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is actually very simple. We want to celebrate creativity and build community any way we can. Our free programming is dedicated to finding and showcasing people who tell stories. So we talk a lot about craft and process. We love getting in the weeds of what qualifies as excellent storytelling, but at a real fundamental level, the best storytellers, in my opinion, are human beings who want to talk to other human beings about real human feelings. And as such, 1455 likes to single out one individual each year who epitomizes the art of telling stories. They use their talents to inform and inspire, who see the mastery of form as always a work in progress, willing to adapt and change with the times, with the goal of communicating and connecting with other people. And also someone who represents the discipline of what goes into this process, but also exudes the joy of what happens when you're doing it at its highest level. So 1455 is proud and honored to present this year's 1455 Storytelling Award to Lisa Ling. Her celebrated career speaks for itself, but during a year of disruption and uncertainty, we want to recognize and celebrate that Lisa illustrates why the best storytellers are so integral to society. Her bio, which I'll read in a moment, is impressive to the point of intimidating, but essentially, my feeling is Lisa is someone who's trying to cover the entire world, one story at a time. She shows us how we work, what we eat, who we love, where we meet, and why everyone has a story that's worth telling. We're indescribably grateful to Lisa for accepting this honor and taking some time out of her impossibly busy schedule to speak with us. So without further ado, let me read her bio. And believe it or not, folks, this is the abbreviated version. If you're not familiar, and you will be after this conversation, go online and check out this rock star. But here is the brief version. Lisa Ling is the award-winning journalist, host, and executive producer of CNN's This Is Life with Lisa Ling, currently in its 8th season. The docuseries offers a gritty journey to the far corners of the US and follows Lisa as she travels across the country, telling stories of communities that are unknown or misunderstood, providing insight into some of the most unconventional segments of society. She also hosts and produces Birth, Wedding, Funeral, a travel docuseries for HBO Max, that reveals the cultures of different countries through stories of rituals surrounding the universal events of births, weddings, and funerals. She also announced in 2021 that she'll launch Takeout, a 6-part docuseries on HBO Max that seeks to shine a light on diverse communities and stories behind America's Asian food scene. Last and definitely not least, Lisa is also a published author of the New York Times bestselling Somewhere Inside, which recounts her sister Laura's captivity in North Korea and Lisa's efforts to secure her release by former President Bill Clinton. So a somewhat impressive resume. Lisa, thank you so much for being here. It's a great joy to speak with you.
No, Sean, thank you so much. Yeah, that was a lot to read, and you did it so effortlessly. I'm so humbled and honored to be recognized by 1455 along with such notable awardees. Thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure. And, as a storyteller myself and someone that really does live to find and celebrate, what we do, I'm looking forward to learning. I picked some questions deliberately so I can take some notes. And, I think the goal of this conversation certainly is to just really recognize and appreciate all that you contribute to society and the art form. But also we want to see a little bit behind, what makes you tick and what drives you to do what you do. So I would love to kick it off. I think I've talked to a lot of writers, and, we always get into the different things that compel people to want to use storytelling form. But what I've found is the one through line, and I really believe that this speaks to your work as well, is the fundamental impulse is just an insatiable curiosity. And great storytellers want to explore our world and talk about the people in it. Is that a fair assessment of kind of what drives your overall agenda?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from my earliest memories include inquiring about this, that, and the other. My parents would constantly, tell me that I'm asking too many questions because I have always had this insatiable curiosity, and I didn't grow up with a lot of money or resources. My parents got a divorce when I was 7. And so I had the television on in my home all of the time. It was sort of my favorite babysitter. And I had a lot of books in my house. And so when I wasn't reading, I was watching television and so on. And I thought that if I could get a job on television one day, that maybe I could have a better life. But there was no one on television who resembled me even remotely, except for Connie Chung. And at the time, Connie she symbolized all that was intelligent and elegant and graceful. And so I sought out to pursue a career like Connie because she allowed me to know what was possible. And if you ask any Asian journalist of my generation, I think it's pretty inevitable that they will tell you that Connie was our inspiration. And I got an opportunity to start traveling as a young person for a show that I started to host and work for called Channel One News. And it was a show that was seen in middle schools and high schools across the country. So if you weren't in school or a teacher at that time, you might not have any knowledge of what it was, but they hired a group of young looking correspondents. Anderson Cooper was one of my colleagues on the show. And at a very young age, I started when I was 18. And by 25, I had traveled to every continent on the globe reporting stories. And it was this incredible opportunity to experience, not only be out of my comfort zone, but just to experience things that in my wildest dreams, I never imagined being able to experience. And I would say that set me on a course to want to continue telling stories and communicating stories of things that I was seeing to a bigger audience.
Well, and so then we flash forward, right, a couple of decades, and here you are operating at the height of the profession. And I think we could attack and assess so many angles why you're just an ideal candidate for this award. But one of the things that I really want to single out is, you your dedication to telling stories for people who can't or won't speak for themselves. I think the answer is obvious, but maybe elaborate a little bit on where that desire comes from.
For me, it certainly happened while I was working as a reporter for Channel One News, the show that was seen in schools. I ended up in places like Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Kazakhstan, Cambodia, in my early 20s. And the things that I saw, particularly in Afghanistan at 21 years old, I mean, when I was offered an opportunity to report on the civil war in Afghanistan in 1994, I couldn't even identify Afghanistan on a map at that time. And in fact, most of the adults in my world, because I was 21 years old, couldn't identify it either. And so I volunteered to go because we'd be going in with the Red Cross. And at the time, organizations, NGOs like the Red Cross, if you traveled with them, the likelihood of something happening was far less than had we not gone in with the Red Cross. So I agreed to go. And from the moment I started to descend from the steps of the Red Cross plane, I was immediately surrounded by young boys who were all carrying weapons that were quite literally larger than they were, Kalashnikovs, RPGs. And I remember asking my escort, how old are these young boys? Because they look no more than 10. And he said, most of them, they don't know how old they are.
Wow.
But if you ask them how to operate bazooka or RPG, they know. And it became very clear to me that those young boys would just sit and day after day, hour after hour, just wait to fire those weapons. And I couldn't even imagine how many times they had done so in their young lives. And I remember thinking to myself, what is going to happen to these boys 10 years from now? And today we are tragically all too familiar with what's happening in Afghanistan. But I came back from that experience as a young reporter, and I tried to engage my colleagues and my friends about what I just experienced. And they had no clue that this scene existed in the world, even though our country, the United States, was so deeply enmeshed in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s, during which time the United States pumped over $1 billion of weaponry, the highest tech weaponry known to man, into Afghanistan so that it could fight a war of proxy against our then enemy, the Soviet Union. And so that moment when I came back and realized that most Americans, at least with whom I was engaging, had no clue that the scene existed in the world and that our country was so deeply engaged at one time in Afghanistan, really propelled me to want to continue telling these kinds of stories. They were enlightening for me in the field, but it became apparent to me that I felt that it was incumbent upon me to try and communicate what I was seeing. And now, Sean, look at where we are today. We are 20 years into conflict with Afghanistan, longer than any conflict in American history. And I would venture to guess, even today, if you were to go out and ask most Americans if they could identify Afghanistan on a map today, despite how long we've been engaged there, I would guess that most people would still be unable to identify Afghanistan on a map. And so it was an epiphany for me at 21 years old that for some reason I was given this opportunity to see what I was seeing, and it became it became this sort of moral mandate that I imposed upon myself to want to communicate what I was seeing and experiencing in the world.
Right on. Yeah, I think one of the fallacies as we get further into the 21st century is the notion I think a lot of us embraced with optimism, which was the internet was opening up, all these barriers to information. Information was free. But what I think we're seeing is the other side of that is that people are still siloed. And in fact, there are entities making money ensuring that people remain in their silos of information. So this democratizing notion of the internet is not, the reward that it was promised to be. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But it calls to mind, you've been quoted as saying, traveling is the best education, which for me immediately makes me think of Mark Twain's immortal observation, which in part states, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. And I think everything you're talking about, your early opportunity to travel, your decision to continue traveling and combining it with this evolving sensibility of, I need to tell stories that, for starters, Americans need to hear. Obviously, that's work you've continued to do.
And the truth of the matter is, Sean, you don't have to leave the country to be exposed or get immersed in cultures that are unfamiliar to you, or to leave your comfort zone. All you have to do is leave your little bubble, and frankly, you don't even have to leave your bubble very often if you just engage with the people who are around you. I mean, you and I interact with people on a daily basis that we don't really know too much about, right? And I would encourage all of us, especially during these times. I mean, you talk about this siloed bubble that we're all in. I mean, you would think that with such access to information, we can find out any score to any game, the weather in any remote part of the world. We can find out about the childhood of Mark, of Mark Twain, right? But yet, what do we actually seek out? What kind of information are we taking the time to seek out? And I think that with the internet, there's just so much that has been so much context that has been lost. And I don't know about you, but there was a time when I started reading novels and reading books on Kindles, and I had to stop myself because I didn't feel like I was retaining what I was reading, because I've just become so compelled to just continue swiping. It's even hard for me to read newspapers. I subscribe to newspapers still. In fact, I had a couple newspapers under my arm the other day, and someone said, "What are those?" Because I think there's great value in the holding books, holding newspapers that are tangible, that you can feel, that you can mark up. And I think that with technology, it's just too easy to swipe through and not retain what you're reading. And these days, as far as social media is concerned, right, most of us, we follow the people who espouse the values and the things that we do, and that alienates us from entire worlds of people who think differently. And that's why we are where we are today. I mean, it doesn't help that tech companies utilize these algorithms that push us even further apart, right? But despite that, our worldview has become increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller. And so, yes, travel is essential, and it has been the best education for me. But these days, I hope people just leave their immediate comfort zone and travel outside of their immediate boundaries, because even when you do that, yes, you can have an enlightening experience and engage with people whose lives couldn't be more different from yours.
Yeah. Well, so one quick thing that you pointed out that I want to kind of high five. I spent many years being a technology analyst, and one of the things I obsessed about as the century wound on, and we were looking at Kindles and we were looking at all this new technology, and I got asked all the time, so when are books going to go away? And my response, which was kind of tongue in cheek, but now I've like doubled down on, is, the paperback is never going away for a myriad reasons, but in my opinion, there's one simple reason. It's the evolution of a format that's been 2,000 years in the making. So it's already a perfect delivery device. We've found out that stone tablets have become pamphlets. It's portable, it's tactile, it's light. You can take it on a plane, you can take it on a bus, you can read it in bed. So I was always bullish that we weren't going to lose kind of the analog world, and I'm happy to see that there is something very kind of sensual about holding it. But also, I really appreciate your point about, I think we've been encultured, right, to quickly read through digital content, and whether we realize it or not, because I share when I'm reading on Kindle, it's not the same experience. So
I'm heartened to hear that you were one of the few voices, because there was a time when we really thought that books were going to become obsolete. And I'm so glad that they haven't, and that reading, I think as a result of the pandemic, right? Reading books is, the notion of it is just flourishing now more than ever. And I'm heartened by that.
Yeah. So my next, you've teed this up perfectly, but one of the things I wanted to mention to you And I'm sure you've heard this before as a former colleague, and I just want to be crystal clear. I intend this with absolute approbation and fanboy as a huge fan of our late beloved Anthony Bourdain. But the work, I think that his superpower, right, of many, because he was just a hero on so many levels. He just had this appetite for interaction, and that led him to a willingness to be uncomfortable in order to get the story. It wasn't a show, it wasn't, a pose. But I think his legacy, in part, which is big and it will grow, in my opinion, is helping Americans better appreciate these other corners of the world that they wouldn't see. But at the same time, he was showing how we're all very much alike. We just have different ways of going about it. And I would very sincerely offer up, you're also doing that work in where you go and what you do. You're seeking to tell a good story, right? Which is critical, and that's to be celebrated. But you're always kind of compelled to be on the less traveled road and just shine a light on these stories that wouldn't otherwise get told.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony Bourdain, may he rest in peace. He really offered something so special. And it's so true. When I would watch his shows, I would truly feel more connected to humanity. And, when I watched his episode about Iran, right? This country with which America has had a contentious relationship for decades. But when he engaged with the Iranian people, it was so heartfelt, so sincere and genuine that I really was able to feel their humanity. And I do try to do that in my work as well. In fact, I had a similar kind of experience in Iran myself in the 90s, a powerful experience. When I first landed in Tehran in 1995, I walked into our hotel in Tehran, and etched in mosaic tile were the words "Down with USA." The hotel. And so immediately I sensed that tension, right? And that conflict between our two nations. And one day I was with my crew, and we were driving through a local park outside of Tehran. And I noticed these groups of young people who were wearing coats that were a lot shorter than a lot of the coats that I was seeing in the middle of the city. And most of the young women had blue jeans under their coats, and many of them had the front part of their hair dyed blonde. And I thought, well, this is an interesting scene. And I asked my escort, the government escort who'd been assigned to us to monitor our every move, if we could get out and engage with the young people. And to my great surprise, he said yes. And so the moment we got out of our car, it became apparent to the throngs of young people that that we were American. And so they started to crowd around our car. And then at a certain point, they started to ask us really probative questions like, do you like Metallica? And are you a fan of Baywatch? I had never, ever even seen an episode of Baywatch. And here I am in Iran being asked about Baywatch. Yeah. And a couple of the young women confided in me, even though there was a government escort standing in close proximity. They said, we wish that our country could experience the same kind of freedom that you experience in the US. And somehow they were able to, smuggle this pop culture, by smuggling satellite dishes or concealing satellite dishes at their homes. And at the time, they didn't have the ability to organize. Fast forward 10 years, or fast forward to 2009, actually. And some of the people watching may recall this movement that took to the streets that became known as the Green Movement, right? Yeah. Throngs of young people taking to the streets, demanding more freedom of their government. And there were so many women in that crowd. And I remember watching those images, thinking and wondering whether those were some of the girls that I met in the park that day. And that experience, like what Bourdain experienced in Iran, these human interactions with people that take you beyond the headlines of a story, right? And beyond the political rhetoric, and give us an opportunity to really engage. And the way I see myself, when you watch my shows, even though of course my name is on the show and I'm prominently featured in them, I'm conducting the interviews.
Yep.
They're really not about me. They are about the people that we are featuring. I'm just the vehicle through which you are experiencing different cultures, different worlds, different people. And these days, I think we're so inundated with information. We're so inundated with media that sometimes it takes a catalyst, right? Or someone to kind of hold your hand
Yes.
to make it a little easier for you to engage. And I sort of see myself as that conduit for people to be able to come along with me on this journey, and people have come to, I hope, trust me enough to take them along to experience things that they would otherwise not be able to experience on their own.
Yeah, I think that's the essence of what you do, and what this type of journalism and storytelling does. And I think that actually that perfectly encapsulates, the energy behind our festival, which is, if someone were to say to me, okay, what do you mean you celebrate storytelling? Of course, we're going to celebrate the more traditional methods, which, again, connect us from 1455 and Gutenberg's press to the present time, and all the democratizing and imagination and inspiring ways that storytelling works. But what we really are trying to celebrate is in 2021, there are a lot of different ways storytelling can work. And your career really crystallizes the combination of, old school words on a legal pad to sketch out the piece, utilizing, cutting edge media, and then establishing a presence on social media so that there's this mechanism by which you're making sure as many people as possible can respond. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about, because you and I are we both at least can remember an analog world. And, so we're indelibly influenced by probably what we came up with, but we've had to adapt to this amazing, revolution of sorts. You've straddled both worlds. How has it been for you to, or how is it different, better, worse, to have to use fundamental storytelling skills, but also be aware of your presence, yourself, interacting, being on film, etc.?
Well, honestly, Sean, it's been something that I've been doing for so long that I don't want to say it's become second nature by any means, but we do, my team and I, there is a formula that we sort of adhere to. And the difference between being out on my own and writing and what I do for my show is I have to give credit to this incredible team that I've been working with for so many years. In fact, between the show that I did formerly on Oprah's network OWN called Our America and this show that I'm doing now, This Is Life on CNN, we have produced over 100 episodes of television together. And we really function as this sort of well-oiled machine. And everyone on my team is as passionate as I am. And we've really raised like a whole generation of producers who started with me from, when they were interns or even production assistants, and now they're producing shows, because it really requires a certain skill set that I think we've really honed, or that our team has really honed. And that is really taking the time before, during, and after to stay engaged with the people who are sharing their deepest hearts and souls to us. And I think it'd be easy for us to parachute into an environment and engage with people and then leave and go about our ways. But it's imperative for us because the experience that we have in the field is so intimate. And people, I think we've built a level of credibility, and people know that we're not going to exploit them, and we're not going to sensationalize their stories, that we are going to give them a chance to tell their own stories responsibly. And we are going to be very responsible about putting these shows together. And so we develop these relationships with people in the field who we engage with, whose stories that we tell. and we take those relationships very seriously, and treat these experiences, treat these stories, and we put them together with a great degree of responsibility, and that's crucial for us, and that's,
Yeah.
you know, for what we do. I think that's the reason why we've been able to be on the air for 8 seasons. I mean, after producing over 100 episodes of television, we've had very few people express disappointment in being part of our shows, because they know that we are going to do everything that we can to, again, tell their stories responsibly. And that, again, it all goes back to that human interaction, right? And respecting the people who have taken the time, who are um, just being incredibly courageous and brave about their desire to want to share their stories with us. And I think that's what makes our shows unique. That's I think what makes me somewhat of a unique storyteller. You know, people often ask me, well, is there a favorite place that you visited? Is there a favorite story that you've told? And the truth of the matter is that I think the reason why I'm a fairly decent journalist is because every story becomes the most important story to me at the time. And when we are in the field, my team and I are just laser focused on how to best tell this story, that everything else just becomes noise, and we become just that immersed.
Yeah. And, you know, Lisa, I've been obsessed, you know, from probably an early age, just reading, you know, writers read about writers religiously. And I found, with very few exceptions, whether it's an actor, musician, or writer, very few of them, when asked about how much they revisit their previous work, they're always living in the moment. And there's really something to that. The eternal present. There's always more stories to tell. There's more work to be done. And I think that's how you keep engaged. That's how you remain curious, and you stay fresh. And it's funny because everything you just said is such a case study for I think younger aspiring writers or journalists. There are no shortcuts, right? There's definitely some tricks of the trade. You've got to learn a discipline and master a craft, but you know, you need to be able to tell interesting stories in order to engage an audience. And in order to continue doing it, you need to establish credibility and trust with the people you're talking to. And you have done that clearly. I think a lot of people take for granted that those are the two pillars. And without those two things, you're either no longer interesting or no one wants to talk to you.
Yeah, when we first started the series on Own Our America, you know, it was a series about American subcultures, different issues that are happening in this country. And my team and I, after producing 8 episodes, we said to each other, how are we going to come up with another 8 for next season?
Right.
Now over 100 episodes in, and there are so many stories left to tell, and new ones evolving all of the time. And you know, our stories come from everywhere. I mean, we're all pretty voracious readers and consumers of information ourselves.
Right.
But very often our stories come from people who just say, look, there's a really, really interesting story that needs to be told. Will you look into it? Yeah. And so many of our episodes have come from people who've approached us and just insisted that we dig into a particular story or a particular world, and there are just no shortage of stories. This season of my show, This Is Life, we're doing something a little different. I'm embarrassed to admit that I had known very little about Juneteenth until last year. Yeah. I'm very embarrassed to admit that, and that propelled me to want to dedicate an entire season to other vitally important moments in American history that didn't make it into the history books, and how in many ways those moments have come to define us, and will continue to define us, and how imperative it is that we identify those stories and dissect them, and to better understand how they have come to impact us. And so our entire season that will launch in the fall is going to be sort of a history edition of our show. And it's just been, Sean, talk about exercising different skills. It's been such an incredible learning experience for all of us. They've been hard to put together because we're infusing our episodes that have always been very present with history. So technically it's been challenging to employ that style, but I couldn't be prouder of this new season and where it's going to take us. Because unless we, the novelist Ocean Vuong, one of my favorite young writers, recently said in an interview, we can't really know ourselves until we know what we've done to each other. And that really, really struck me. And I think that when you watch this season of our show that will launch in the fall, you'll get a pretty good sense of how what we've done to each other has really impacted where we are today and how we can evolve past it, evolve and move through it, and eventually, hopefully, get to a better place.
Well, Lisa, I mean, I don't even need to editorialize to suggest that that's so critical right now, where we are as a country, that's so timely and relevant and necessary. And I think it's safe to assume that will open up some minds and do some necessary work that we all need to be doing. So I salute you for that. And that just, is yet another reason why we tip our hat and say, this is our storyteller of the year, but we look forward. I want to look back briefly, if you'll indulge me. We talked about this a little bit in our correspondence, but it actually ties a couple of threads together. My own former life, or whatever we want to call it, when I was a tech analyst, I went out to the CES show in Vegas every year for like 15 years. And this reminds me not only of what I wanted to mention to you, but also this notion of our silos. And even when we think we know a thing or two, as anyone that's traveled to Vegas, I think on business, right? The whole point of that place is you stay on the strip. So even though the strip's big and there's a lot going on, you're in a very curated experience, and it's very safe to a certain extent. Of course, being there on business, I would get in cabs and the cab driver would say, yeah, let me take you the back way to the convention center. So we were literally getting off on back roads. But what I started to understand and appreciate was, and I had no idea, and I think it's safe to say most Americans, maybe most Nevadians didn't know, is there's a literal underworld of the dispossessed and the working poor. And so I became a little bit obsessed. I've written some poems about what I saw and talking to cab drivers. But then I saw your episode, the impeccably titled Lost Vegas. And for me, Lisa, again, I think this reinforces everything that we're talking about. I didn't think I had become an expert. I would have never put it in those terms, but I knew more than I did. Your episode really brought it home for me and showed me how little I knew. But maybe just talk a little bit about, I won't say that's my favorite so much as, to me, that epitomizes, even for someone that knew what you were exposing, you got in there and talked about and talking about stories that wouldn't get told. It was a profound experience for me. So A, I want to thank you for that. And B, maybe just talk a little bit about how you discovered that and what brought you, into that place.
Well, certainly. I mean, I think we all know Vegas as obviously Sin City, right? As the ultimate sort of indulgent, excessive
Yes.
environment. But what many don't know is that there are hundreds of miles of storm drains that run beneath the Las Vegas Strip. And it has been inhabited by, as you said, homeless people, those who have those who are dispossessed. And it is this world that exists beneath Sin City that is astounding. People have apartments essentially set up. They've rigged water to be able to flow in certain parts. They ride bikes. They have furniture. There are twin and queen size beds that are brought down into these storm drains. And the people who live and have been inhabiting this world, they often come out when, I mean, Vegas is a 24-hour city, but they look just like you and me. And during the lull of a night of gambling, right? They will go into the casinos to see if money has been left in slot machines, and they essentially exist on that money that they've been able to scavenge and live in this world. And it's astounding. And frankly, so many of these people, um, their lives aren't, or their former lives weren't that different from yours and mine. They just happened upon unfortunate circumstances, right? But it's important for us to find those stories, because again, it's now more than ever, as we've been existing in these bubbles, to be able to convey and to share these stories of these other worlds that exist quite literally in our own backyard. Again, I talk about how we don't have to leave the country. We don't have to travel far to find these worlds. They're everywhere. We just have to take the time.
Right.
And I've found as a journalist that not only do I become a smarter person as a result of becoming more aware of these communities and these worlds that exist in our own backyard, but I become a better person. And I think we could all use a little more of that these days, and just opening our minds to
Right.
how different people who are different from us live and think.
Yeah, and I think we talked about travel, we talked about curiosity as kind of the fundamental kind of pillars of what makes certain storytellers tick. I think the other ingredient, which is both what one has and one seeks to kind of inculcate in viewers, is empathy. And in my opinion, in my humble opinion, it's impossible to not cultivate empathy if you're constantly learning about other people who, again, might be very different in so many ways. But again, at a fundamental level, we're all trying to secure, comfort and safety for our families. We're trying to make better lives. Ostensibly, many of us are at least trying to make the world better, and we're fighting the forces that oppose that. But empathy, right, is what drives. And in my opinion, I don't think it's a stretch to say you are infused with this empathy and curiosity. That results, to me, is your secret power. The empathy to seek out these stories, and then you're sharing, or you're inspiring empathy in others, which is a great gift for humanity.
Well, thanks, Sean. I mean, it is so true that I think we are fast becoming a culture that is becoming increasingly more devoid of empathy. And I think that our reliance on technology, right?
Yes.
And again, we may see things on social media or virtually that tugs at the heartstrings, but it's just so easy to just swipe through. And this is scary.
Yes.
And so I have found that through the medium of television, I think we're still able to allow people to feel compassion, or to encourage human beings to be able to think a little bit differently. I mean, there's no comparison to books in being able to do that. But I do think that through television, there still are those opportunities to be able to do that. But especially now, when I think about the state of Texas and how there's a movement to not teach racism in schools. This is absolutely terrifying to me, because it's when kids are their brains are still developing. I mean, empathy is something that can be taught.
Yes.
Right. And during this critical stage of brain development, to not teach, again, what Ocean Vuong said, what we've done to each other. How can we really understand who we are, right? Unless we know what we've done to each other. And to eliminate that from curriculum for elementary school students, to me, it breaks my heart. And I can't think of a worse thing to be doing
Yeah.
for our future humanity than to eliminate the teaching of racism in our country and in the world among elementary school students. And so empathy is, you know, it's become this sort of like catchphrase that people are talking about a lot, but it's so central to be able to treating each other right in a humane kind of way. Otherwise, we're headed down a deep, dark path.
That's right.
And we're already on that path.
Well, and, you know, I mean, I think you look at the trajectory of human history, and unfortunately, you know, we have not often been, you know, at our best as a species. And I think, you know, what your work does, what Anthony's work did, what good writing does is show that, you know, if you can break bread with someone, it's a lot harder to antagonize them or not see their humanity. We don't have the luxury to be able to do that on a mass scale. So for me, where I choose to see, you know, where I remain optimistic despite the odds is with storytelling. It's affording people the opportunity to connect, to learn more, to get outside of their silos. And, you know, that's why we're celebrating, you know, the craft. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But boy, it's an antidote to apathy and despair. And I think it makes many of us happy warriors to try to, you know, encourage empathy and, you know, get people to see that we're kindred spirits and that we're only going to go as far as we can if we're supporting one another. So once again, that gives me an opportunity to genuinely thank you for your career in doing that. You know, you're literally fighting ignorance and making it harder for tuned in people to tune out.
Well, thank you, Sean. It's something that I take very seriously, that I recognize the need for, not just for me to participate in it, but for all of us. Again, to just take that time. There are people in your office whose stories you might not know, right? You might engage with them. I visited this high school, this public high school in downtown LA. It's a public charter school. And they did something really incredible freshman year. A lot of these kids, they're from the inner city, and they've gone through some really hard things. And on the first day of school, they ask every single student freshman year to write an essay about something hard that they're experiencing right now, that they don't mind sharing, that they haven't really told too many people about. And so every student is obligated to write that essay, and then they put it together in a book. And they make every student freshman year read the entirety of the book. And to me, that is something that I wish we could all do. Because, you know, when you think back on high school, and I don't know about you, but I remember I had categorized people. I had stereotyped people. You know, the good-looking jock had this perfect life, right? And I had so much going on in my head and in my life that I repressed. But if I had just known that good-looking jock at the time in the 80s was repressing the fact that his father was gay at the time, and that was the reason why he never allowed anyone to come to his house, right? Or that, you know, my very good friend who I spent so much time with, that her parents were, you know, would have these ugly physical fights regularly, but she never shared that with me. If I had known that then, right, it would have been inevitable for me to have a bit more compassion, right? And for those stereotypes to have been, you know, to have been able to sort of abolish those stereotypes. And that was just an exercise that I thought was so smart, that I wish that more schools would do, because it gives students a better understanding of their fellow students, and therefore allows them to become more empathetic and compassionate about the things that their fellow students are going through in their lives.
Here, well, maybe you and I can do our modest parts to try to make that more aware, because I couldn't agree more on all levels. I mean, heck, even at the workforce, if you had to know a little bit something that the company made you say, that might break barriers down and afford better communication and more kind of understanding and empathy.
Yeah, I think also you would ensure a more productive workforce, right? Because you are
Imagine that, right?
your employees to be their authentic selves and to share those things that they've been holding inside of them, and to hear them out with compassion. That to me would propel me to work a lot harder for the company.
Sure.
Because they have given me this outlet and this space to be able to share and get things off of my chest.
Yeah, I mean, I refuse to be cynical, especially in this conversation, but I would just simply suggest that, of course, there are moneyed interests that are very invested in ensuring we don't connect and communicate effectively. But again, that's just another opportunity to point out that honest storytelling is the best way to break those barriers down, whether they're self-imposed or enforced by the powers that be, whoever that is. Being able to tell stories and share is a way to not be alone and feel isolated, which I think usually leads to some of these societal issues that we've talked about. So Lisa, I want to be really respectful of your time, but I also always want to be cognizant of the young aspiring writers. If someone were to say, Lisa Ling, I want to be you, where do I start? I know that's a very complicated question and it's not easily answered, but what advice would you give for a young aspiring storyteller to get started, especially in an age that's a much more complicated than when you and I were starting out, putting pieces of words on paper?
I don't want to sound like a broken record, Sean, but to me, I think the key to storytelling is just to be a sponge that just wants to absorb as much about people and things and cultures and worlds and as you can, and try to engage with people who think differently than you do, who live differently from you. To me, that it has been the essential component for me, just taking that time to leave your comfort zone, right? And to engage. I mean, again, like you will immediately be filled with stories. And it's your job to try to communicate those stories in a way that allows others to feel what you felt when you engaged. And those things are precious to me. Those interactions are precious. And you have to me, just continue to be just a keen observer and inquirer. And that to me is that is the first step to being a really skilled storyteller. I mean, obviously learning how to write, but observing and engaging to me is that has been those have been the most important things for me.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, in addition to thoroughly enjoying this conversation, as I knew I would, what you've basically done is give us the service of a masterclass in less than an hour of everything that makes someone like yourself tick, and your honesty, your willingness to discuss, what makes you tick, how you operate. We're so grateful to have that opportunity. And I'll just say, the world I live in, I'm constantly fascinated by, we can and do celebrate art and storytelling and creativity, but we're also in an era, justifiably, where we're struggling with how do you separate the art from the artist. And, sometimes not so great people make, wonderful art, and we need to grapple with that, how we deal with it. We need heroes. So when we encounter people that are operating at a very high level and benefiting humanity and showing us how it's done, and are also so demonstrably good human beings full of curiosity and passion and empathy, it's an extraordinary blessing. So from the bottom of my heart and on behalf of 1455, it really is our pleasure and our honor to associate with you and recognize you. And I'm certain that this opportunity will inspire so many people to really understand what we mean when we say we celebrate storytellers. So I just thank you for being here and leading by example.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's been a pleasure. And all I will say is, to what you were saying about the fact that we need heroes, they are all around us. They really are. We just have to take the time and exert a little bit of effort sometimes to find them, but they are all around us.
So Lisa, we will put all this information. We're going to do a write-up. We put all of our content on our YouTube page. But in closing, if someone's watching this, especially someone that is not an investigative reporter and says, how do I find Lisa? How does someone find you online to take a deeper dive into what you do?
So people can find me I have an Instagram page, Lisa Linkstagram. I'm on Twitter, although I don't love Twitter, but I'm at Lisa Ling on Twitter. Instagram is just it's a bit more cordial.
Yes.
Than the other social media outlets. On Facebook, facebook.com/Ling. So that's how people can find me on social media. My show, This Is Life, comes back in the fall. And I'm also currently shooting a show called Takeout, which you mentioned, which is an exploration of Asian American history and culture through the lens of food. And we've already shot 2 episodes, and I cried 3 times during a food show. But I hope that you'll check that show out as well.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much. All the best wishes, all continued success and health. And you have a permanent home here at 1455. So we will look forward to continuing to celebrate you and keeping in touch. But again, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Sean. So appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the next show.
This concludes the 10 a.m. Eastern Time session of Track 2, Timely and Topical, entitled A Conversation with Storyteller of the Year, Lisa Ling. 1455 would like to again thank our sponsors and panelists for their support and participation in the 2021 1455 Summer Festival. In a moment, we will be ending the live stream, but before we go, we encourage you to check out and purchase books from today's speakers. Purchasing a book or 2 is a great way to support our authors and speakers who have donated their time to be here today and to support a local independent bookstore. Please visit the 1455 website at 1455litarts.org/summerfest-books, where you'll find a listing of books organized by author last name with links to purchase from our independent bookselling partner, The Potter's House. Finally, the Summer Festival doesn't end with this session. We encourage you to use the links above to navigate back to the Attendee Hub and join one of our upcoming sessions, or check out any of our earlier sessions that you may have missed that are available for on-demand viewing. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.